Hello again, 3302 folks. I don't know how many of you had a chance to watch the first video that I made. Again, I hope these have been helpful. But if you did get a chance to see it, you saw that about halfway through, there was no more sound. It turns out, I think, that when I was moving the QRI5 book around, I hit my keyboard, and I think one of the, like the space key is the mute button. I had no idea. I hit it. So I keep talking for another 20 minutes or so without sound. So we're going to pick up where that sound left off. In the first video, we were reviewing the practicum assignments. We talked about how there are 3 assignments altogether, and how the assessment project, which is the first assignment, has 3 parts. Right, so that should sound familiar if you watched the first video, at least the part with sound. So the 3 parts of the assessment project, just to review, were the observation of students, the interest interview, and the QRI5. And you give the QRI5 again to 1 student. The QRI5 now has some different parts to it, right? So we're just sort of breaking the assignment down piece by piece. And the first thing that you start with, that we've talked about in the first video, are doing word lists. So you get a general sort of narrowing down, you get a ballpark of what levels are the child's frustration level, instructional level, and independent level. You start to get a ballpark. And then that helps you move on to the passages. So that's where the sound left off in the first video, and that's where we're going to pick up today. When you have an instructional level from the word lists, that is the place that you start the passages. Okay, so we had a sort of made up 5th grade example student. So let's take that student again. And you did the word list, and you found out that that child's instructional level from the word lists is level 5, right? 5th grade. Great. So you're going to start with a level 5 passage. Now, as I was explaining, right as the sound finished, page 99 has this whole list of all of the materials in the back of the QRI5. So once you know what level of passage you're looking for, this is the page you should turn to. And again, all these materials are on the DVD, so you can print them the same way you could Xerox them from here. So I can see by looking at my QRI5 book that there are several choices of passages. And you'll remember that the reason that the QRI5 supplies a variety of passages, and one of the reasons that we as instructors really like to teach you this assessment tool for the intermediate grades, is because there's a range of topics, first of all. So children will need to have a sense of some prior knowledge so that they can read their best. But also some are narrative and some are expository, right? So that also helps when you're trying to assess intermediate students' comfort and knowledge level about text types and varieties, right? So we know that different kinds of genres and different kinds of text types and different kinds of organization of text, right? Whether there's headings, diagrams, maps, right? All of those things can affect how well a child comprehends. So the QRI5 gives you different options. And one thing that is really, I think, kind of exciting about the QRI5, it can be overwhelming when you're just learning, but one thing that's exciting is that I tell my face-to-face students all the time that it's not a magic box, right? This isn't anything magic. It's not like you drop the child's hair in and it spits out a number. This child reads at level 6, right? You have to do a lot of thinking as the teacher. You have to use your professional knowledge and think about, what is it that I want to assess, right? What are the skills that I need to know about this child's reading? What are the things I think they do well? What are the things I think they might be struggling at? And how can this tool help me be more specific about that knowledge? So if you are teaching in a grade, or you are teaching a unit where certain kinds of text features are going to be more important, that coming year, then at the beginning of the year, you might want to test or assess, I'll try to use the word assessment, that's much better than test. You might want to assess that child's knowledge about those text features, right? So that you know when you plan your instruction what support different children will need, okay? So that's one reason that there's choices, and that's one reason that this is, I think, a really helpful assessment tool to know about and to be able to use as a teacher. Okay, so here we go. We know what level, and we're going to pick one of the level 5 passages, And we see here there's one on Martin Luther King and one on Margaret Mead and one on Patricia McKissick and one on farming on the Great Plains and one called The Octopus and one called How Does Your Body Take in Oxygen? Okay, so we could choose. There might be a reason to choose one over the other. You could think about that, and that could be part of your reflection. But there's no right answer for this assignment. So just because of the new memorial that was dedicated on the National Mall in DC and all, let's read the Martin Luther King passage. So we turn to that passage in our book. Now there's a copy for the student, right? So in this case, the Martin Luther King passage for the student is on page 286 in our book, and it looks like this. Okay? So that's what you would give to the student. And you, as the person giving the assessment, would have this page on 292. Whoops. Right. Okay. Okay, so the first thing you'll see, I have to not hit that button again, goodness. The first thing you'll see on 292 is that we don't just hand the kid the story and say, read, right? There are these questions over here, and they're labeled concept questions. Now, we've been talking in 3302, and I'm sure you've been talking in other read and elementary and other education classes about the importance of prior knowledge. So we know that a student just doesn't have one level, right? We know from this QRI-5 that there's already 3 levels. There's independent, instructional, and frustration. But even within those levels, different texts are easier or harder for different children to comprehend, right? We talked a little bit just a second ago about the text features, right? If a passage has lots of headings and subheadings, that might help some students with their comprehension, and it might be confusing for others, depending on their experience and their knowledge with those kinds of texts. Same thing about topics of texts, right? If you were a child who had just moved to this country from somewhere far away, right, where people didn't talk about Martin Luther King, then maybe the Martin Luther King passage would be difficult. Maybe something like farming or octopus, those might have been concepts that you experienced in your life in wherever you lived before. So maybe those are easier for you to use to transfer your background knowledge to. We don't know. It's just it's a possibility. If you are a child in this country and you've grown up here, chances are that you know something about Martin Luther King, right? He's become a very popular figure to talk about in schools, especially elementary schools. So most children that you work with will probably have some grasp of that idea and will probably be able to use what they have learned about Martin Luther King, what they've heard about Martin Luther King, what they've heard about the civil rights movement, to be able to support their understanding of this passage. But we're going to check that with these concept questions. Okay, so that's what the questions are meant to do. They're meant to, as a rough assessment tool, to see whether kids understand enough to be able to read the passage. So you would ask, who was Martin Luther King? Now there are scoring guidelines, again, in the QRI-5 book. So let's see where they are. If you turn to page 48 and 49, you'll see there's a whole section on scoring the assessing prior knowledge. And they'll give examples of what kind of answer would earn 3 points, what kind of answer to a concept question would earn 2 points, and what kinds of answers to a concept question would earn 1 point. And so you ask students those concept questions, and you score them really quickly, just to get a sense of, can I move forward with reading this passage? Is it fair to ask the child to read this passage based on what they know? And you'll see on page 51 that the QRI-5 says, generally we have found that students who score at least 55% of the points possible on the concept task score above 70% on comprehension questions in the related passage. Okay, so that's saying if you know about half, if you get about half the points, a little more than half of the points on the concept questions, then studies have shown that probably you'll be able to comprehend pretty well, right? At least it gives you a fair shot. Now, some people have said things like, well, if he knows a lot about it, then I should give him another passage. No, you're not trying to trick the child, right? This is not like, oh, he knows about that. Let's find something unfamiliar. This is not that kind of assessment, okay? You're trying to understand what the child can comprehend from what they read. It's not a test, right? It's not a trick. So we actually want to make sure that we're assessing their reading, not how much they can learn about Martin Luther King in 2 paragraphs. Right? So it's okay for the child to have familiarity with the topic. In fact, it's a great thing. If you go through and you answer these questions, you ask the child these questions, and they know the concepts, they're able to answer the questions, they're able to give answers that score well, then you say that the child is familiar with that topic and that passage. And so you go ahead and have them read it. You'll go on to the next part. If the child is really unfamiliar with the topic, right, just doesn't get that 55% of the points for these questions, it's recommended that you try to find another passage. Okay, that's, again, why we have choices. You don't give a different level. You just try to find something that the child has enough background information to be able to meet the knowledge of the passage and be able to read it effectively. Okay, so you would try, maybe they know more about farming. Maybe they know more about octopus, right? And they don't have to know all the details. It's just a general understanding, okay? So that's the concept question part. At the end of the concept question, you'll also ask students to make a prediction, and that will also help you understand whether you think they're ready to sort of read on in the material. After the concept questions, okay, so once that part's finished and you decide this child is familiar, we're going to move on with this passage, then you ask the child to read it. And it's okay for this assessment that they read out loud. For some of the older grades, sometimes you could have them read silently, but we want to practice some other skills, so we can have them read out loud. And as they read, you do a running record, okay? What's also called a miscue record or miscue analysis, okay? So that's why you have the passage here, okay? So as they read Martin Luther King Jr., when Martin Luther King Jr. was a boy, many laws would not allow black people to go to the same place as whites. Some people thought blacks were not as good as whites. Black children could not attend some schools. Okay, the child will be reading, and you will be marking the differences between what the child says and what's on the page. That's what a miscue is. A miscue is a disconnect between what the child actually says and what is written down. Okay? Now, there is a way of doing miscues on, I just saw it, where'd it go? It's chapter 9 in your book. It starts on page 60. Okay? So if you read on page 60 and 61 and the following pages, you'll see the kinds of things that you need to mark as the child reads, and you'll see how you can mark them. I don't mind, and others, people who have other instructors, you might need to clear this with your instructors. I don't mind if you use these specific markings that they tell you, or if you have another set, maybe from 3301 or another class that you've practiced running records, if you have another set of markings that you use, that's fine with me. But it has to be consistent, right? So you have to be able to go back and understand exactly what the child said based on your markings. And I need to be able to go through and see what the child said based on your markings. So just know that. So on page 60, they give you the kinds of things that you need to mark, right? So things like substitutions, when a child says a word that's a different word. So if the child instead says attending a school says aggravating a school, right? Whatever, substituting a word, just sort of getting it wrong. If they leave out a word, if they insert an extra word that's not actually on the page, you can mark things that they maybe get wrong and then self-correct, right? So if the child says black children and white children attended a school, right, and they fix it, that's a self-correction. If they ignore punctuation, you can mark that. But what you'll notice when you do this is that not all miscues are equal, right? They don't all matter in the same way. And again, it explains how you can score those in that section 9. But it's good once you have that marked you can look more closely at the kinds of mistakes a child is making, right? It sort of freezes the reading on the page and lets you go back and think about it. So what are the patterns that you see, right? This is the way we use it as a teacher, right? This is the way we think, okay, this assessment is helping me learn about the student. So the child reads and you mark all of these different, all the different ways that a child, what the difference between what the child reads and what is on the page. And you look, now remember that it's gonna go fast. Okay, the child is not going to stop and wait for you to write down the error. So you have to keep going. That's why the markings and getting comfortable with the markings and making them consistent is important. Okay. Now you'll see at the end of the passage, there's this box, right? And this is where you score the running record part, the miscue part, okay? So we've covered the concept questions, we've had the child read, and we've marked as they read, and now we're scoring that part. And you'll see there's a difference between total accuracy and total acceptability, and this has to do with whether the miscue changes the meaning, right? So there's a real difference between saying something like, maybe the sentence is, the boy and the dog play outside. Okay, pretend that's what's on the page. There's a real difference between saying the boy and a dog play outside versus something like the boy and the dump truck run outside, right? Those are really significant changes. So if you change the to sure, it means that you weren't following the words exactly as they were on the page. But when you're for your comprehension and for the meaning you can make from the passage, it's almost the same, right? The dog and a boy, the dog and the boy. You understand what you're reading. If you change the word dog and substitute dump truck, suddenly the whole picture of what you're reading changes, right? So those kinds of miscues we call meaning change miscues, right? Because they make a big difference. There is a really fine line sometimes between whether a miscue changes meaning or not. Don't get caught up on it. Think about it, reflect on it, but don't get caught up on it. And again, it will talk about some of the ways to think through that in the book, okay? So you go ahead and score the miscues. And this will give you a sense, based on the miscues, of where this independent instructional frustration level are, right? Now, it's not going to be, that's not the whole assessment, so you don't know overall, but you just say, in the reading, this is what the score is, okay? So you've done the concept questions, you've had the child read the passage, and you've done your running record. You pause. Well, you don't have to do it right then. You could even do this part later, but maybe. I have to think through that. You want to get as comfortable as possible with the scoring so that you can do it quickly. So then you count up the miscues and you see where the child falls in terms of their reading and the running record part. And that gives you a little box for how to score that. Okay. Then you ask the child after they read the passage to tell you what they read. And some kids won't play this game quite as well as others. So you might have to make it a little bit of a funny thing. Because if you're sitting there listening to a child read, and the child reads, and then you turn to the child and say, okay, what did you just read? There's a chance that child could look at you like you are crazy. Like, you just heard me. Why would I tell you? And I think they have a point, right? So you're going to have to say something maybe like, pretend I just came in the room, or pretend I didn't hear any of that. Tell me as many things as possible that you remember from what you just read. Something like that. And some kids don't need that kind of game, but other kids will look at you like you're crazy. So you'll see, again, on the scoring sheet that you have this, all of these lines with all these different phrases from the text itself. So as the child does a retelling, you check off all the things that the child says, okay? All the things that the child remembers and recounts. If it's a little bit of a different wording, again, you have to use your judgment. You have to use your professional knowledge and think about that. But, you know, if it's close, I think it shows that the child remembers they just read that. So you go through and check off all the things that the child says in the retelling. The retelling is not actually used for scoring. Okay, so it doesn't come into like the numbers and the math that we'll do at the end here. But it can be a lot of good information for you as an instructor. So someone in my class was showing me the other day an example that they had done with a child, and we noticed that the child didn't remember a lot of the beginning details, but was able to get almost all of the middle and ending details. That's helpful information, right? If you're going to be that child's teacher. It helps you know that maybe at the beginning of the story he hasn't gotten into that story yet, right? He doesn't quite know what's going on, so those details don't have a place to sort of latch onto, right? He hasn't set up that story, but as he goes, he's starting to build his understanding, so then he starts to be able to remember more details. Maybe that's what's going on in his head. We don't know, but we can think about it. Or maybe that child can remember the things that he said more recently, right? Maybe the beginning of the story is just a little too far away for his short-term memory to really like click in right now. So maybe you could practice remembering the beginnings of stories, because you would have the information that maybe that's something the child needs some support with. Just an example. Okay, so you count up the number of ideas that the child gets and you put that on the line that says number of ideas recalled. Great. So then the last part here for the passages are a set of comprehension questions. Now, comprehension questions are asking a child questions about what they read is not the only way to assess comprehension, right? We can do a lot of other things. We can talk with the child, we can conference with the child, we can see what the child writes, we can see what a child creates in terms of like a visual display or an artistic project. So don't get locked into thinking that you have to ask a child questions to see if they understand. There's a lot of other things you can look at to get at a child's understanding. But asking questions is one way, and it's kind of a fast way, and it's kind of an easy way, so it's the way that this tool uses. So you'll see that there are both implicit and explicit questions, right? And they're marked that way on the page. Now you should probably know those words, but just to review, explicit means that it's actually in the book, right? That phrase or that exact idea was in what you read. For example, if the passage said something like, Joni and Susan and Malik were in 3rd grade. They went to the zoo. And the question was, what grade were Joni and Susan and Malik in, right? The answer is 3rd grade. It said that. That's explicitly said. An implicit question, on the other hand, isn't exactly in what you read. You have to make some inferences. You have to make some abstraction. So, for example, in the Martin Luther King questions, one of the implicit questions is, what was Martin Luther King's main goal? And the implicit answer is that he wanted equality, right, especially for African American or Black people. It doesn't say in the passage, Martin Luther King's main goal was, but it's about that. Okay, so that's why it's an implicit question. The student can get the answer from reading, but it's not exactly in there. Again, that can be something interesting as an instructor to notice. Does the child do better with implicit questions? Does the child do better with explicit questions? You know, that's something that we can pay attention to. If the question is an explicit question, just notice that the answer should come from the text. So, for example, in the Martin Luther King passage, a question is, in some cities, what did Blacks have to do on a crowded bus? The answer that was in the reading says, give up their seat to a white person, right? The bus is crowded. It was in the South, in many southern cities. If the bus is crowded, then, and Black people are sitting down, Black people had to get up so white people could sit down. Okay, that's the answer. You could imagine that a child could answer that question from another source of knowledge, right? So in some cities, what did Blacks have to do on a crowded bus? They could say, get off, or find another way home, right? That's not the wrong answer to this question, but it's not the answer that was in the reading. So if we want to assess what the child understood from their reading, then we want to make sure that their explicit answers are the answers that come from the text. Okay, does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Again, exact wording is not the point, right? Rephrasing is fine. You know, summaries are fine, synonyms are fine. So don't get too caught up. Again, it's just a place you'll have to use your professional knowledge. Okay, so you do the concept questions, you have the child read the passage, you do all the miscues, you do the retelling, then you ask the the comprehension questions at the end. You'll see again, there's another scoring box at the end of the comprehension questions. You figure out how many the child got right, and you add it up. So now you have a score, again, just with the passages. You have a score for concept questions, but we don't have to worry about that. That just helped us know, should we read the passage or not? So don't worry about that score. Now you have two scores. You have a score from the reading, when you did the miscues, and you have a score from the comprehension questions. Well, how do you decide what the child's instructional, frustration, or independent level is? How did the child score on this particular passage, right? So we have to find a way to bring those two scores together. Luckily, again, our book helps us. So let me find it for you. This is why you have to spend a lot of time reading this book and understanding how to use the tool. Okay, so the miscue scoring is in section 9, which we talked about. The retelling scoring section is in section 10, although I think you'll be able to figure that out pretty well. People haven't seemed to have trouble with that. And how to score the questions is also in section 10. And I'm looking for this other section that I had marked somewhere. Sorry, just give me 1 second. Okay. So you'll want to look at two different parts when you're trying to figure out the overall score for the student in the passage. Here it is. Okay. So the two places that you'll want to look are on page 58, right, which is in section 8. And then you'll want to look at page 87, okay? So page 58 has this really helpful little chart here. How to find an instructional level. And these are all my notes. You can see I spent a lot of time with this book going through and making sure I could find the parts that I needed later. So I would recommend you do the same thing. On page 58, you'll see that there are two columns. There's a column that's labeled WR, and then there's a column labeled comprehension. And then they're given overall score. Okay, so this is saying that how do you bring those two scoring boxes together? So the WR, I think it stands for word recognition. And then the comprehension is the comprehension questions. So word recognition is how well did the child read the passage, right, when you were doing all the miscues. It's not the word list. Again, we're done with the word list. We're done with the concept questions. So we're just looking at when the child read and when the child answered the questions right now. Because the other things just helped us narrow down to say that we could read this passage. Now we're trying to see what happened when we read that passage. So the WR, word recognition or word identification, that's what happened in the miscue section. So if, when you counted up the miscues, the child did really well, right? Very few miscues, read every word just the way it was on the page, then that might mean that the child's, then the child would score an independent, right, on their miscue section. So if that were true, if the child had an independent level when reading aloud, and their comprehension, I'm just reading across right now, the comprehension questions, the child also, she scored independent on the concept questions, then that means, the comprehension questions, I hope you caught that mistake before I did, good job. Then that means that the overall level is independent, right? Independent in the first part, independent in the second part, overall independent. I think we can agree on that. If the child reads aloud at the independent level, But the comprehension questions show an instructional level score. Okay, so great with the reading, you know, instructional level, again, it's not a judgment, they do fine on the instructional. Then we're going to say that overall that's an instructional level, right? We got to think for a second about why. Why would we value, in this case, the understanding that a child had to show their comprehension after reading more than we would value whether they said all the words right? I think it's because we want to know that kids can make meaning. So being able to read aloud in this, you know, lovely way and not make mistakes, that's great, right? Decoding is important. Fluency is important. But we really want to know what the child understands about that reading, right? It's not so much a fancy performance. It's about what do you get from it? What does it mean to you? So I think that's why in this case the comprehension would have a little bit more weight, okay? Similarly, if the child reads aloud at an independent level but comprehends at a frustration level, then we're going to say that that's a frustration level, right? Again, it's about what you can understand. So you can go ahead and look when you have your two scores from those two sections. Go ahead and use this chart and sort of find out what your students' combination of things are to get an overall assessment level for that passage. And then the other page I said I think was 87, right? This should look like the chart you have in your template. So this is where you can sort of record all the information. So the first, sorry, there we go. The first passage you give, you would put the name there, the level there, whatever. If you have to give a second one, which we're just about to talk about, then you could put them in this column. If you had a third one, you could put them in this column, etc. Okay. And there is an example of this filled out in your book as well, so you can double check. It's on page 97. So if you have questions about how to do that, here's page 97, and it's all an example of the chart all filled out. Okay. All right, so in our fifth grade student, right, let's go back to our fifth grade student for a second. We're almost ready to part ways with him, but we've done all of this different assessment, and when we got the QRI-5, we did the word list and we narrowed down, and then we gave the child a passage and asked his prior knowledge and assessed that, and that looked strong, so we read the passage, and then the reading was strong, and then we asked the comprehension questions, and the child remembered all the details. So we're really seeing independent level now suddenly. What do? We just gave a fifth grade passage. We thought that was going to be the instructional level. It turns out it's independent. We have the answer you don't want to hear. You do a level 6 passage, right? If you're finding the independent level, you have to find the instructional level. That means you have to keep going, okay? So you do the concept questions, you do the passage reading, and you do the comprehension questions with one of the level 6 passages. And again, you would pick them out of the book. If the child reads the level 5 Martin Luther King passage and ends up with an instructional level, then what do? Right, you're done. You found the instructional level. That's the place where you want to tailor your instruction as a teacher. Now, there might be a range of instructional level. If you were this child's teacher or you needed to do a really in-depth assessment, you could still go on either side just to double check to find the range of instructional level. But for this assignment, that is not necessary. If you find the instructional level, you're good. Now, what if in the reading of the words, and this is going to happen more often than not, they do all the word lists and they narrow down to level 5. So you give the level 5 passage and the child has a lot of miscues, enough to be, overall between the miscues and the comprehension questions, the child scores frustration level, not instructional like you had hoped or like you had predicted. So then what? You thought this was going to be instructional, but you find it's frustration. Then you give a passage from the next level down, so from level 4, because you have to find the instructional level. That's the goal, okay? Because if you don't find the instructional level, how will you know where to give instruction? Okay. So that's the overall QRI-5 process, and that's actually overall the whole assessment assignment. I hope that helps. So just really briefly to review, 3 practicum assignments, 3 parts to the assessment project: observation, interview, QRI-5. The QRI-5 has several parts. You start with word lists, at least 2 levels below the child's grade level, so you can start to narrow down. Once you have an instructional level from the word lists, you use that level to find a passage. When you pick the passage, you have to decide, which one might be a better fit for the child, which one has features that you want to assess. You ask I keep getting this confused, the concept questions that assess background knowledge. You have the child read the passage, you do the miscue markings, you score that. You ask the child to do the retelling, and then the comprehension questions. And between the comprehension question score and the miscue score, you decide overall whether that child's level for that passage is independent, instructional, or frustration. If it's instructional, you're good. If it's frustration, you do a passage a level below. And if it's independent, you do a passage above. And you go through the passage steps again until you find the instructional level. Makes it sound easy, right? All right, I know that's a lot of information. I hope hearing it and sort of walking through some of it was helpful. Remember, you do have all of this information. This has all been given to you before. So sometimes you need to be a problem solver. You need to be the one to either ask very specific questions. Where do I find the page for scoring the miscues? I've looked here and here and I can't find it. And sometimes you just have to go back through and read. Reread the commentary, reread the news forums. That's where all the important information is. So look there first if you have questions. Be a problem solver, take some responsibility for your learning, but we're also here to help you. So let's just balance, the work that we do, the work that you do. Together will help you be successful in this course. All right, good luck. I can't wait to hear all the things you learn from working with your student.